Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're opening up a file on military history that is really focused on one singular isolated battle. It's a story that kind of defines the limits of human commitment against just overwhelming odds.
Hmm.
We're turning our attention to the Himalayas and specifically the Battle of Rezangla. It was a brutally consequential fight during the 1962 Sino-Indian War.
And this deep dive isn't just about, recording a historical tragedy. It's really about understanding why this specific stand by just 120 men became such a permanent fixture in global military lore.
Right.
To set the stage, you have to understand the geopolitical reality of 62. The tensions were already boiling over along that disputed border, and the Ladakh region, this vast high-altitude desert, that was the critical theater.
And when you say high altitude, we really need to stress this. It's not just a geographical detail, it's a combat factor in and of itself.
Oh, absolutely.
So we're zeroing in on Rezangla, a high mountain pass in the Chushul sector. Our mission today is to quickly unpack the context, the unforgiving conditions, and the staggering strategic significance of this one desperate fight.
The conditions there are almost surreal. You're talking about an altitude of over 17,000 feet.
Yeah.
That's higher than Everest Base Camp.
Wow.
It's barren, it's completely unforgiving, and the temperatures just plummet far, far below freezing.
So the air itself is the first enemy. At 17,000 feet, you've got about half the oxygen you have at sea level. And that doesn't just make walking hard.
Yeah.
It can trigger things like cerebral and pulmonary edema. It makes any physical exertion agonizing, and it just tanks your reaction time. For these guys, they weren't just fighting the Chinese. They were fighting severe hypoxia every single moment.
And that hypoxia, it just impacts everything, logistics especially. You can't run, you can barely even walk.
Right.
Carrying ammunition, food, medical supplies, it becomes a Herculean task. Equipment malfunctions all the time, and even basic stuff like sleeping or just warming your food becomes a huge challenge.
Yeah. So let's look at the specific unit holding this critical pass. It was C Company of the 13th Kuman Regiment, and their total fighting strength was just 120 men.
Yeah, just 120. And this small unit had a very specific identity, which is important. They were primarily Ahir soldiers from the plains of the Rewari district in Haryana.
And that fact, their background, it's so crucial.
It is, because these were men from a place with a fierce martial tradition, sure, but they were plainsmen.
Right.
Suddenly, they're fighting a battle on the roof of the world against an enemy that's not only bigger, but also better acclimatized. The odds they faced weren't just bad, they were, statistically impossible.
Okay, let's unpack this. So the defense was really centered on their commander, a man named Major Shaitan Singh. He was basically the force multiplier for this tiny unit.
He was.
What was the state of the actual defense lines he managed to set up? What did they look like?
Well, Major Shaitan Singh was tasked with fortifying a position that was logistically remote and, technically indefensible by any modern standard.
So no concrete bunkers or anything like that?
No, nothing like that. The positions relied entirely on these low stone walls, known as sangars. They were built from the rubble and rocks of the mountain itself.
So they offer some cover from direct fire, but that's about it.
Exactly. They are completely vulnerable to mortar fire, and maybe most critically, they offer zero defense against that freezing wind and the biting cold.
So they were exposed constantly, basically fighting a battle for survival before the enemy even showed up. But why was this specific awful location, Rezangla, so vital to the bigger strategy?
Rezangla was the key to the Chushul Valley. It's as simple as that. If the Chinese forces captured this pass, they would have a direct line of sight and a completely unobstructed path right down to the crucial Chushul Air Base.
And that airbase was the supply line.
It was essential for the Indian defense. It provided surveillance, supply lines, everything across the Ladakh sector.
Yeah.
So losing Rezangla meant potentially losing the ability to project power in the entire region. The stakes were enormous, totally out of proportion to the tiny force defending it.
So it's clear that Major Shaitan Singh and his men, they knew they were the cork in the bottle. And that stopper was tested to its absolute limit on the morning of November 18th, 1962, when the Chinese assault began.
Yeah, and the Chinese attack wasn't subtle. It was launched in wave after wave, using the terrain to their advantage.
Yeah.
They likely started with heavy mortar and machine gun fire, followed by just relentless human wave assaults up the icy slopes.
And what we know from the few survivors and from inspecting the battlefield later is that the Indian response was immediate and incredibly determined. Despite being hammered by enemy fire, the defense became ferocious. But what really set the resistance apart was the visibility, the actions of their commander.
Yes. What's fascinating here is how that extreme pressure forged Major Shaitan Singh's leadership.
Yeah.
He adopted this doctrine of direct visceral command. He wasn't sitting back relying on a radio, which probably didn't work well anyway at that altitude.
Right.
He was physically moving between posts, which were dangerously spread out across the ridge, checking ammo, giving orders, and just providing that moral support, face to face.
That level of exposure is just astonishing, and reports suggest he wasn't just directing, he was physically involved in the logistics of the fight.
Yeah, we know he was actually seen carrying heavy belts of ammunition himself,
Right.
running from sangar to sangar, resupplying the positions that were just burning through their limited stock.
That says so much, a commander doing the grunt work under fire just to keep the line alive.
And that physical leadership, well, that's what drew the heaviest fire. Major Shaitan Singh was grievously wounded by machine gun fire relatively early on in the battle.
And this is where it gets really interesting.
It is. This is a moment of just extreme commitment. His men tried to move him to safety, but he flatly refused to be evacuated. He insisted that every able body stay on the line and that he would continue to lead until his body gave out.
An almost impossible demand. A dying commander ordering his troops who are already on the verge of collapse to fight to the last.
And that order, fight to the last bullet, the last man, it defined the next few hours.
So the combat then just devolved into this brutal, close quarters affair.
Exactly what you'd expect. The Chinese forces had the numbers, they had the higher ground in some places, but the Kuman defenders, using their knowledge of their own rudimentary positions, they inflicted a stunning number of casualties.
And to give you an idea of the intensity, the Chinese advanced with everything they had. It forced the defenders into this desperate calculus of when to use their final rounds. And this is the detail that truly sticks in your mind when you study this battle. As the ammo inevitably ran dry, no resupply was possible, no artillery could reach them, the defense didn't just crumble.
No, they pivoted to something primal. The accounts confirm that soldiers, having fired their last round, didn't surrender. They charged. They used their bayonets until they broke.
And man.
Then they used the rocks and stones littered around their positions, throwing them. And finally, there are accounts of soldiers engaging in barehanded grappling, fighting tooth and nail in the freezing dirt.
That level of unyielding resistance is what elevates this from just a battle to a moment of legend. The grim reality is that they fought until every single bit of their physical capacity was gone.
And the result confirms that commitment. When the ceasefire was finally declared and inspection teams reached that remote position, which was months later because the weather made it impossible,
Right.
the scene was one of unparalleled devastation. Of the 120 men who held that ridge, 114 lay dead on the battlefield.
And the findings gave historians this chilling, vivid picture of that final stand. Soldiers were found in their sangars, many with empty magazines, some still clutching broken bayonets, and some with fractured skulls, indicating they had, in fact, fought with rocks.
And Major Shaitan Singh himself was found precisely where he had ordered himself to stay mortally wounded, slumped against a boulder, his hand frozen, still gripping his weapon. This wasn't a rout. It was a stand where every man followed his orders until death.
His unparalleled bravery was recognized posthumously with the Param Vir Chakra, which is India's highest military decoration. But we have to ask the critical question for a deep dive. Why did this tactical loss, this massacre, become such an immense strategic gain?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the sacrifice at Rezangla bought something priceless: time.
Time.
The objective of the Chinese forces in that sector was to seize the Chushul airstrip and push into the valley quickly, before the weather or international pressure forced them to stop.
And the ferocity of this one company just shattered that timeline. The sheer unexpected tenacity of the defense and the extremely heavy losses they inflicted on the attackers, it shocked the advancing Chinese regiments. It forced them to pause, to reorganize, to reassess the cost of pushing forward.
That pause, however brief it was strategically critical. It allowed the rest of the Indian defenses in the region to consolidate, and it played a significant role in slowing the overall momentum of the Chinese offensive in the Chushul sector.
So the delay caused by Rezangla was a major factor.
It's widely accepted that it was a major factor in preventing the Chinese from achieving their ultimate objective of taking that valley floor before the unilateral ceasefire was declared just 3 days later.
So what does this all mean? It means that 120 men achieved a mission that was far beyond their physical capabilities. They turned a situation of total military disadvantage into a victory of, moral and strategic deterrence.
Exactly. The battle serves as this profound, enduring testament to the fact that an unbreakable, defiant spirit can have tangible strategic results, even when you're facing inevitable tactical defeat.
Wow.
And the legacy of Rizang La, it persists not just in military history books, but in the institutional morale of the Indian Army. It's held up as the gold standard of duty and sacrifice, and the position itself is now a solemn reminder of that valor.
The memorial that stands there today, it has an inscription that just perfectly captures the intensity of their mission. It reads, "How can a man die better than facing fearful odds for the ashes of his fathers and the temples of his gods?"
Which tells you this wasn't just a fight for territory. For them, it was a defense of cultural honor and duty.
So, in the end,
In the end, Rizang La is so much more than a statistic from a forgotten war. It's an enduring symbol of courage, of duty, and the indomitable spirit of the soldier. It reminds us that honor and moral duty can burn brightest, even in the face of certain agonizing death on a frozen mountain pass. It fundamentally changed the narrative of the 1962 war from one of just overwhelming defeat to one defined by localized, defiant heroism.
and when you look at that defiance, it raises a powerful question for you, the listener, to think about. Given these overwhelming physical and tactical disadvantages, the crushing altitude, the lack of support, the sheer impossibility of winning, the resistance shown by Major Chetan Singh and his men was an act that prioritized moral duty over tactical survival.
Mm.
So what specific combination of physical endurance, cultural heritage, and leadership pressure must come together to forge that kind of unyielding defiance when physical victory is entirely out of reach?
It's the highest expression of the principle of the last man standing. And it asks us to reflect on the nature of sacrifice when there's absolutely no possibility of rescue or relief.
That's the legacy of Rezang Law, echoing across those unforgiving frozen slopes. We'll leave you with that thought for this deep dive.